The dress was ivory. Odette had sewn it, stitch by stitch, over the course of 3 long weeks, piecing together scraps of fabric she had gathered the way a squirrel gathers seeds before winter. A ribbon here, a length of pale silk, traded for 2 baskets of apples there. A hem taken from an old curtain that had once hung in a house neither of them could afford to remember. And she had worked by candlelight most nights, needle-catching the small flame tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, refusing to stop even when Aveline told her to sleep. Because Odette was 21 and 21 still believes in beautiful things. Aveline was not sure she believed in them anymore. But she stood now in the entrance corridor of the great hall of the Northern Kingdom, torches throwing gold across the old stone columns, the murmur of hundreds of voices braided together with the distant thread of stringed music, and she looked down at the dress her sister had made. And for the first time in a very long time she thought, maybe tonight, which was a dangerous thing to think. She knew that. She had learned it early. Growing up without a father, without a mother, without the shelter of a strong pack to close around her, like a fist around a coin, she had learned that to want something too much was the same as handing it a knife and turning your back. To need was to be soft. And soft things did not last long in a world like hers. Still, the dress was beautiful. And Aveline, poor girl, from the village of Elmsworth girl, who sold fruit at a wooden stall and slept in a bed too small for 2 grown women, looked perhaps for the first and only time in her life, as though she belonged somewhere like this. Corwin will see me, she thought. He will see me, and he will remember why he chose me. She pushed the thought away before it could set roots. You're staring at the floor again. Odette appeared at her shoulder hair, tied back with a strip of the same pale fabric. Cheeks flushed with the heat of the torches and the thrill of a night she had never in her life expected to attend. People at balls are supposed to look up. That's the whole point. Looking up at each other. I'm looking at the dress. The dress is finished. I finished it. It's not going to run away. Odette linked their arms and tugged her forward into the light, into the warmth, into the crowd. Chin up. You made me a promise. I made you a promise. You promised you wouldn't spend the whole night pretending you'd rather be selling apples. And despite everything, despite the fear, coiled quiet in her stomach, Aveline felt her mouth tug against her will. Because that was Odette. That had always been Odette. They stepped into the hall together. The ceiling rose high and vaulted above them, ribbed like the inside of some enormous rib cage, and from the beams hung the banners of the Pack families, in long symmetrical rows, colors deep and old and proud. The tables along the walls groaned under the weight of roasted meat and pale wine and fruit stacked in bright pyramids, and Aveline, who had spent her whole life on the other side of tables like these, felt something twist low and strange in her chest. But the center of the hall was empty, deliberately empty, kept clear, because the center was where the claimings happened. The moonball was a thing older than the title of Alpha King itself. One night a year, when the Pack families of the North gathered under one roof to forge alliances, celebrate unions, and claim their mates before witnesses, because a bond claimed before witnesses could not, by the oldest laws of the shifters, be undone. Each year the ball was held in a different court, and this year, this single impossible time, it was held in the North, the kingdom where Aveline had been born and raised and had sold fruit while dreaming of things she could barely find words for. It was the only chance she would ever have. The next moonball would be held in some far southern court in lands she would never reach without money, and she had no money. What she had was Corwin. She had met him a little over 2 years ago, on a morning the market fell into chaos. A band of merchants had come before dawn and stripped the villagers' stores bare, and Aveline, who always arrived early to set up her stall, had been the first to see it. And she had not waited. She never waited. She had started shouting, organizing, moving people, putting bodies between the panic and the bloodshed, before the panic could become bloodshed. By the time Corwin's father arrived with armed men to settle the thing, Aveline had already settled half of it herself. Corwin had looked at her across that mess. Sweaty, furious, hair loose and voice steady, and the scent had struck them both at the same moment. Like a hand to the chest, like recognition, mate. His family had not been pleased. He was heir to the Vale, named son of a well-bred house with old ties to the northern court. And she was the daughter of no one from a house so small, it barely cast a shadow. But Corwin had come to her anyway, and he had made her a promise in that low, even voice she could still hear when she closed her eyes. At the ball I will claim you before everyone, and after that, no one can contest it. So Odette had sewn a dress, and Aveline had spent 2 years guarding that promise, the way a person guards a flame in a high-wind, hands-cupped breath, held never once admitting aloud how afraid she was that the fire might go out. She found him before she knew she was looking, which was an old habit, a trap she never seemed to climb out of, always locating Corwin first, as though a room only arranged itself into sense once she knew where he stood. He stood across the hall between his father and 2 men she did not recognize, dressed in the Vale colors, dark hair, combed back, jaw clean. He had always been handsome. That had never been the problem. But there was something in him tonight, a stiffness in the shoulders. The particular way a man holds himself when he is bracing against something. And he was not looking at her. I was working very hard, she realized, at not looking at her. His eyes moved everywhere in that hall, except the one place she stood. And the flame in her chest guttered. Just once. Just slightly. No. Don't. Not now. Did you see him? Odette whispered. Yes. Is he coming for you? Aveline did not answer, because she did not know. Because for the first time since she had put on this dress, she felt she might not know anything at all. What she did not notice because she was looking at Corwin, because she was working so hard to keep the fear off her own face, was that there were other eyes in that hall. Eyes that had found her before she had even crossed the threshold. Across the room, near one of the tallest columns, 3 men watched the movement of the night with the particular stillness of those who have never once had to try to be noticed. Not because they were arrogant, though 2 of them were each in his own separate way, but because there was something in the manner the 3 of them held the space between them, shoulder to shoulder, unhurried at ease, that made it difficult to look at anything else once your eyes had landed there. The Duskbane brothers of the South. Torin was the youngest. 22 and built like something forged rather than born. Brown hair falling careless over his brow. Arms crossed over dark clothing. A cloak stirred by the hall's breath that he did not appear to notice. His eyes moved across the room with a methodical, sweeping precision. The gaze of a man who leads a royal guard not because a title was handed to him, but because his nature simply does not know another way to stand in a room. Beside him, Aldrich carried the same blood in an entirely different key. 25 black hair to his shoulders, arranged with the studied carelessness of a man fully aware of its effect. A long leather coat clasped with gold. He held a glass of wine and watched the room the way a merchant watches a market. He already understands, as though he had reached some conclusion about the night that no one else had yet been told. And then there was the eldest, Thane, 33, Alpha King of the South. He stood beside his brothers the way a mountain stands beside its foothills, without competing, without needing to. Dark hair cropped close, a jaw like a decision already made, and eyes a blue so deep the torchlight seemed to fail against them. He carried the build of a man who did not train out of vanity, but because he bore the weight of an entire kingdom on his back, and his body had learned over years to match that weight. I was not looking at the wine. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at the girl in the ivory dress. The claimings began around the second hour. Aveline stood near the drink tables with Odette when the first bell rang, the old clear signal that a mate was about to be claimed at the center. The first two were met with warm applause, the couples stepping into the open space with the plain, uncomplicated pride of people standing exactly where they were meant to stand. Aveline waited. Corwin had come to her only once so far. Briefly. A smile that did not reach his eyes, and an "I'll come for you soon" that had left his mouth too fast and settled in her stomach like a stone she kept trying to swallow around. He will come, he promised. Another bell. Another couple. Odette had gone quiet beside her, which was worse somehow than anything she could have said. The hall grew warmer. The wine loosened tongues. And Aveline had begun to do the private arithmetic of the humiliated, counting the minutes until she could tell her sister she was tired and leave with her head up before the not knowing became a knowing she could not survive standing. And then the bell rang again, and she saw Corwin walk to the center of the hall. He's coming for me. The relief was so physical it moved her body before her mind agreed to it. A half step forward. Breath caught, heart slamming. She felt Odette's hand close around her arm, felt her sister's whole face light with "I knew it all along." But Corwin stopped alone, and in a voice pitched firm and loud enough to leave no corner of that hall. In doubt, he said, "I, Corwin, heir of the House of Vale, before these gathered families, dissolve the bond between myself and Aveline of the village of Elmsworth." The hall went silent, the way a hall goes silent when something breaks. Aveline did not move. She could not. Because the floor had changed beneath her feet, she was certain of it. Certain the stone had turned to something else, something that would not hold. And she needed a moment, just a moment, to understand whether she was standing, whether she was breathing, whether she had heard the thing she thought she had heard, or whether there was some other explanation, some misunderstanding, some word she had missed that would rearrange the sentence into something survivable. There was not. Corwin stood at the center, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on some middle distance that was very carefully not her. And beside his family stood the young woman who had arrived with them earlier, well-dressed, well-bred, wearing the small, composed smile of a person who knew exactly what was about to happen and had known it for some time. The dissolution was public, final, older than any of them, and irreversible. And suddenly, the dress, the beautiful ivory dress her sister had sewn, stitch by stitch, by candlelight, felt like the most foolish thing Aveline had ever put on her body. Odette moved first. She stepped forward on instinct, and Aveline felt her sister's hand land on her arm, the way you might touch something you are afraid will shatter if you hold it wrong. No, Aveline thought. Don't defend me here, please. Because if Odette said one word, if anyone said one word, Aveline knew she would come apart right there, on the stone, in front of all of them, in the dress. And she would rather have died than come apart in that hall, in that dress, in front of those people. So she did the only thing left. She lifted her chin, by millimeters, by a margin that cost her more than anything she had ever done. And she said nothing at all. At the center, Corwin moved again toward the waiting young woman this time, and the bell rang once more, and it was a different claiming now, one that Aveline had no right under any law to interrupt. She turned to her sister, and her voice, when it came out whole. She did not understand how. "Let's go." She had taken perhaps 8 steps toward the doors when the scent reached her. It was a strange thing, impossible to explain to anyone who was not a shifter, the way a wolf's senses gather what the eyes cannot. And what reached Aveline in that moment was not the scent of one man. It was the presence of something. Heavy, distinct, absolutely deliberate, moving toward her with the unhurried calm of a thing that knows it will arrive no matter what she does. She stopped. She turned before she had fully decided to. 3 men were walking toward her, through a space the crowd had cleared without being told to clear it, as if some collective animal instinct in the room had decided that stepping aside was simply the wiser choice. The Duskbane brothers of the South. The name she had heard, whispered all night by people who stood straighter when it passed their lips. And they were crossing the floor toward her shoulder to shoulder, with the ease of men doing the most ordinary thing in the world, which this very plainly was not. The youngest reached her first. He stopped 2 steps away and inclined his head. "Torin Duskbane." Just that, as though the ought to be enough. And looking at him, Aveline was not entirely certain it wasn't. The middle one offered a broader smile and a bow that in any other context might have been called excessive. "Aldrich Duskbane, at your service." A pause. Though if I'm being honest, I would greatly prefer it the other way around. Behind him, the eldest cast. His brother, a long, flat, sideways look that clearly meant something. Aveline could not translate. Thane did not introduce himself right away. He stayed where he was, 1 step behind the others, arms loose at his sides, simply looking at her with a quiet attention that she felt should have unsettled her far more than it did. "Thane Duskbane," he said at last, low, even, just the name. And somehow from him it was enough. Aldrich stepped forward, smiling. "My brother is far too modest. He's the Alpha King of the Southern Lands." A deliberate beat. All 3 of us are Duskbane Alphas, but he's the one who signs the decrees. Aveline looked at the 3 of them. At the hall. Back to the 3. What is happening? They were introducing themselves to her. 3 men who could have stood anywhere in that hall, beside anyone in it, and instead they were standing here in front of the girl, who had just been publicly unmade, introducing themselves as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "They pity me." Heat climbed her face. "That's what this is. They pity me." Torin tilted his head slightly as though he had heard the thought pass through her. "Don't wear that look." She frowned. "What look?" "That one." He gestured at her face with no ceremony whatsoever. "You're far too beautiful to waste it like that." Odette made a sound beside her that was not quite a choke, but was dangerously close. Aldrich raised his glass toward his brother, with the air of a man appraising a painting. "Torin, with all the political delicacy one expects from the commander of a royal guard." He turned back to Aveline, and his smile changed softer, more deliberate, and if anything more dangerous for it. What he means in the only language nature ever bothered to give him is that this entire hall became a great deal more interesting the moment you walked through that door. Aveline opened her mouth, closed it. They are flirting with me. The thought arrived with a kind of stunned clarity. The three Duskbane brothers of the South are flirting with me, in the middle of the moonball, while the man who was meant to be my mate claims another woman 20 paces to my left. She began. And the dress, Taurine continued, as though she hadn't spoken with the same flat objectivity a man might use to assess a battlefield, is the finest one to walk into this hall tonight. I command the royal guard. Judging what deserves attention is quite literally my profession. Aldrich nodded with grave seriousness. It's a very demanding post. Aveline looked at Odette. Odette was staring at the two brothers like a woman watching a performance she had not paid for and had no intention of leaving. Not helpful. Not helpful at all. You don't even know me, Aveline said, sharper than she meant to. We know enough. Aldrich again, easy as breathing. We know, for instance, that the man who just unmade you in front of this entire hall is a tremendous fool who does what his father tells him as though he were still a boy who needed permission to breathe. There was a fraction of a second where Aveline did nothing. And then, without deciding to, her mouth betrayed her again. Thane saw it. He had stood one step behind his brothers since the beginning, watching the whole thing unfold, with the expression of a man observing something proceed exactly as he expected it to. But when that small, unwilling change touched her mouth, his eyes shifted to her face, with an attention different from the others, quieter, deeper, as though he were setting the moment somewhere he intended to keep it. I'm glad you're smiling, he said. Just that. But the low pitch of it made Odette turn her head slowly toward him, like a woman recalculating a sum. And then the young woman moved. Not Odette. The other one. The one who had waited at the Vale family's side, with her composed, certain little smile, the one Corwin had claimed at the center of the hall not 10 minutes before. She crossed the space between them quickly, before anyone in her own family thought to stop her, and she came close enough that only Aveline could hear her, and her composed smile was gone now, and beneath it, her eyes were something else entirely. I'm sorry, she said. 2 words, barely a breath. Aveline stared at her. I didn't ask for this, the young woman went on fast, and low fingers twisted white in her own fine skirts. They arranged it. His father and mine. I've never even... She stopped herself, swallowed. You should know it wasn't a contest you lost. There was never a contest. It was decided before either of us put on a dress. And then, before Aveline could find a single word, the young woman stepped back into the crowd and was gone, folded back into the Vale colors. Her composed smile snapped back into place like a shutter over a window. It was decided before either of us put on a dress. Aveline stood very still, because that changed the shape of the thing. Not the pain of it. The pain was the same, but the shape. She had spent the whole night believing she had been weighed against another woman and found wanting. And instead, she had been weighed against a ledger, against a bloodline, against her own empty pockets. And the other woman had been weighed too, and had lost in her own way, and neither of them had ever stood a chance because the scale had been rigged before they arrived. Aveline, Odette's voice tight. What did she... But Aveline never answered, because the footsteps came. They were not ordinary footsteps. They were the kind the whole hall hears before it sees. Heavy, measured, carrying the particular fury of a man who had miscalculated his evening and was only now far too late beginning to understand it. She did not need to turn. She felt Corwin before she saw him, the way she had always felt him. Except this time, what reached her was not the bittersweet familiarity she had lived inside for 2 years. It was heat, anger, and beneath the anger, thin and ashamed and unmistakable, a layer of something that could only have been regret. He stopped a few steps from the group. His eyes swept across the 3 brothers, reaching for authority, and landing somewhere between authority and poorly hidden fear. "You have no right to her," Corwin said. Aldrich turned to him with the mild curiosity of a man who has encountered an interesting sentence in a conversation he had already considered closed. What a fascinating position. He swirled his wine, coming as it does from the man who publicly surrendered every right he ever had to her, in front of all of these people. "This is none of your concern." It wasn't. Aldrich agreed with a politeness far sharper than any insult. "And then you made it everyone's. You rang a bell about it. Now it rather concerns the whole hall, which, let us be honest, was your decision, not mine." Corwin stepped forward, and his eyes finally found Aveline's, and there was something in them she could not name at first. Possessiveness, perhaps. Or the shape possessiveness takes once it has lost every legitimate claim to itself and simply refuses to go quiet. Aveline. No. One word. It came out before she thought it. It came out whole, and it did not tremble, and Aveline was faintly astonished at herself. Corwin stopped, and Thane, who had said nothing since the moment Corwin arrived, who had let the whole exchange happen without stepping into it, watched her say that single word, with his arms crossed and his blue eyes steady, and something in his expression was not enjoyment exactly, but it was a long way from neutral. He's letting her speak first, Odette realized, watching him. He's letting me speak first, Aveline realized a half-beat later. And there was something in that, in the deliberate choice not to step in front of her before she needed one, that landed with a weight she had not been braced for. "You dissolved the bond," Aveline said to Corwin, her voice level with the effort of a woman who knows the alternative is losing hold of it entirely. "Before everyone, with the bell ringing. You don't get to stand here now. I made a mistake." And there was real urgency in it, urgent enough to be infuriating. "My family, my father, I know what your father did." Torin's voice cut across the hall, and every trace of the lightness he had used with Aveline was gone from it. This was the commander of the Royal Guard now, and every syllable landed exactly where he placed it. "He told you to cut the bond with your mate because she was poor, and you obeyed him, in a full hall, with the bell ringing." A pause. "And now you're standing here claiming rights you threw away with your own mouth." Corwin turned on him. "You will not?" "I will not what?" Torin took a step, small in distance, enormous in meaning. He was 22, with far less political weight than either of his brothers, but he led the guard of the most feared kingdom in the south, and his body knew what it was before his mind ever had to confirm it. "I'll tell you what I will not do. I will not stand in a hall and watch a man ring a bell to throw a woman away, and then draw his sword when someone better bends to pick her up." The hall had gone entirely silent now. Not the polite silence of people pretending they weren't listening. The real thing. 400 people who had stopped breathing at once because the scene in front of them was the kind that gets retold for 3 generations after everyone in it is dead. And Corwin Aveline watched it happen, watched the exact moment arrive, made a bad decision. "I claim the right of contest," he said. It was not a private thing anymore. It was a formal declaration, loud enough for the elders at the back of the hall to hear it, and be unable to pretend they hadn't. By the old custom, she was mine first. I claim the right to fight for what was mine. And something in the room shifted the way a room shifts when a word has been said that cannot be taken back. Torin's mouth curved. It was not a kind curve. "Then let it be recorded," he said, "that I contest as well." His dark eyes went to Corwin without a shred of ceremony. "All three of us contest." Aldrich lifted a hand unhurried. "Confirmed." Thane said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough, and every soul in the hall understood it as such. Corwin looked at the three brothers, and Aveline watched with a clarity that was almost cruel the moment he finally grasped the size of the thing he had set in motion. He had calculated a confrontation. What he had found was a war. Across the hall, she felt before she saw the eyes of the Vale family. Corwin's father, Lord Aldous Vale, stood rigid in the particular way of a man who has spent months arranging an evening and is now watching the entire arrangement come apart in front of 400 witnesses. And his face was not embarrassed. That was the thing Aveline would remember. In all of it, in the whole ruin of the night, his face wore no embarrassment at all. It wore calculation. As though even now, even watching his son's folly detonate in the center of the hall, some cold, patient part of Aldous Vale was already counting, already measuring, already turning the wreckage over in his hands to see what might still be made from it. He's not upset, Aveline thought, and a cold thread of something she did not yet understand slid down her spine. Why isn't he upset? But there was no time to follow the thought, because Torin had already reached up and unfastened his cloak, and Aldrich was handing his wineglass to a passing servant with the calm resignation of a man who had suspected all evening the night might end exactly this way. And Thane simply waited. Hands loose at his sides, his eyes finding Aveline's face for one long moment before they returned to Corwin. "You'll be all right," that look seemed to say. She did not know if she had read it correctly, but she felt it. Wolf's change at the center of a stone hall was not the thing. The old tales made it. No thunder, no blinding light. It was quicker than that, more instinctive. It carried a quality almost of inevitability, like a tide that does not ask the shore for permission before it rises. The four men shifted nearly at once, and the hall drew back as a single body to clear the floor. Elders and heads of families taking their positions along the walls, with the practiced ease of people who had watched such contests before, and knew the safest ground was outside the reach of it. Odette gripped Aveline's arm hard enough to bruise. Aveline laid her own hand over her sister's and did not move. 4 wolves stood at the center of the hall. Corwin lunged first, which made sense. Anger brings speed and strips away judgment, and he had come to this already furious. Furious. From the moment he had seen Aveline nearly smile at a stranger. Torin met him head-on without a step of retreat, and the fight between them was short and violent and unbalanced from the first heartbeat. Because Corwin was a well-trained son of a good house who had learned to fight, and Torin commanded the royal guard of the most feared kingdom in the south, for whom fighting was not a skill, but a native tongue. It did not take long. Corwin went down with the quiet suddenness of a man who has met far more than he came prepared for, and Torin stepped back without a shred of triumph. It was not a victory worth savoring. Then the two brothers turned to face each other, and Aveline saw something pass between them. A wordless thing, too fast to follow the kind of exchange that only exists between people who know one another so completely they have no more need of language. Then they moved, and the fight between Aldrich and Torin was another thing entirely. Longer, more even, carrying the particular quality of two men who know each other's every motion by heart and still refuse to hold back. Aldrich yielded first. He went down with more grace than anyone had a right to in wolf form, which Aveline thought even then, even with her heart in her throat, was entirely in keeping with everything she had learned of him. And then, only Torin and Thane remained. The hall fell quiet in a different way, because there was something in how the two of them regarded each other across that open floor that ran deeper than any contest. Years of shared training, of pack bond, of something older than either. And there was something, too, that looked very much like a younger brother who did not entirely wish to lose. The fight between them was the longest of the three, and the most brutal, not out of greater anger, but out of greater equality, and equality makes every single advantage cost twice its price. Thane bled. Torin forced him back once, and then a second time. And Aveline, who had walked into this hall, trying only to keep anyone from seeing how afraid she was of an entirely different thing, found herself standing at the edge of the cleared floor, with her pulse gone wild and high for a reason she could not begin to explain. Why is my heart doing this? She had no bond with Thane. No claim, no mark, nothing at all to justify the tightness that had taken root in her chest the moment those blue eyes had first found hers across the room. And yet there it was, uninvited, inconvenient, absolutely her own. Torin stumbled. He lost his balance for the fraction of a heartbeat that proved enough, and Thane pressed him down with a weight that was half strength and half something harder to name, that particular pressure of an alpha king that existed somewhere before the body, that other wolves felt before they were ever touched. Torin lay still a moment, and then Aveline saw it clearly. He stepped aside. He conceded, voluntary, the kind of yielding that exists only between brothers. The hall let out the breath it had been holding. Thane turned still in wolf form, great dark blue eyes finding Aveline at once, as though nothing else in the entire hall deserved his attention, and he crossed the floor toward her with slow, deliberate steps that made the distance between them shrink with an inevitability she felt in her spine before she felt it anywhere else. Then he lowered his head. It was not submission. It was acknowledgement. And every shifter in that hall felt the difference because the difference was vast. It was the way an alpha recognizes something he has judged worthy, and in the gesture, there lived a language older than any ball or bell or decree. One of the elders stepped forward and extended a dark cloak edged in gold, the mantle offered after a contest, and there was a formality in it that acknowledged the legitimacy of what had just happened before 400 witnesses. Thane took it. The change came swift and quiet, and when he rose, he was a man again. Dark hair damp and disordered from the fight, a cut along his jaw already ceasing to bleed, blue eyes lifting to her face. And then he knelt, the Alpha King of the South, kneeling, at the center of the northern Moonball Hall. Aveline could not move a single muscle in her body. "You owe me nothing," he said. His voice was low, but the hall had gone so utterly silent that it reached every corner of the stone. "And you need no reason at all to say no. But I would have you know that the asking is real." A small pause. "Will you be my mate, Aveline?" The hall did not breathe. She felt Odette beside her, gone completely still. She felt the eyes of 400 people, She felt Corwin, a man again, now somewhere at the edge of the space carrying his anger, and beneath it, a pain he had earned and would feel anyway. She felt the two brothers Torin, with his arms crossed, and an expression she could not fully read, Aldrich, with the corner of his mouth lifted in something that was almost but not quite a smile. And she felt Thane, kneeling, waiting, making nothing easier for her, demanding no swift answer, simply present, with a clarity she found harder to endure than everything else the night had thrown at her. I am indignant, she thought with a frankness that nearly undid her. I am indignant that my night has turned into this, that I am standing in this hall making this choice, that he is exactly that he is. So absurdly, no. Don't think about that now. I accept, she said, and the words came out with a firmness that surprised even her. Thane did not smile at once. He held her gaze a moment longer with that quiet focus, as though he were setting this moment to somewhere. He meant to keep it. Then he rose slow, close enough that she had to lift her chin to hold his eyes, and he brought his hand to the side of her neck with a gentleness she had not braced for. The mark was sudden heat, deep and unforgettable, because it was not only a thing of the body, it was the bond, closing, different from what she had felt with Corwin, different in weight, in texture, in everything. That had been recognition, a thing that happened to her. This was choice. What she had not anticipated was her own traitorous heart, which chose that exact moment to hammer so hard and fast that she was mortifiedly certain any shifter within 3 paces could hear it. Or her legs, which had carried her through humiliation and silence and the whole length of that impossible fight, choosing that precise instant to forget entirely what legs were for. The floor went soft beneath her. Do not faint. You will not faint now. Please, but the body has opinions of its own. Thane's hand reached her waist before she understood she was falling. Firm, warm, settling at the curve of her, the way a thing settles when it has noticed something before you have admitted it yourself. It was not dramatic, discreet enough that only those very close would ever have seen it. He simply held her there and studied her as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, as though she were not the first person he had ever marked, and he simply knew, for reasons she could not begin to explain, that she needed exactly that exactly. Then, she did not look at him. She faced the hall instead, chin lifted, his hand at her waist, a thing she was in no way prepared to examine in public. Why did he have to notice, she thought, before I even had to ask? And across that hall, in the tall shadow of a stone column, Lord Aldous Vale watched the Alpha King of the South steady. A fruit seller's daughter on her feet watched the mark settle warm against her throat, and did not look away. He was not angry. That was the thing. I was thinking. The South arrived sooner than Aveline expected. It was not a border marked by walls or gates. It was a change in the air itself, warmer, denser, carrying the scent of red earth and pine resin drifting down from the hills, as though the whole kingdom had exhaled, and she had walked straight into its breath. The pack received them in the castle courtyard, with the quiet organization of people who had done this many times before. And Aveline noticed with a strange delay, before she understood what she was noticing, that there was no ceremony. No one bowed. No one made speeches. The people were simply there. Men, women, some plainly warriors and some plainly not, and between them and the 3 brothers, there was something she could only name as belonging. Not subjects receiving a king, a pack receiving its own. So this is what it looks like, she thought. and could not finish the thought properly to have a real one. The room they gave her was larger than the entire house she had grown up in, which was both remarkable and somehow faintly unbearable. Odette's was next door along the same corridor. Her sister stepped inside, looked around with her eyes gone wide, and then looked back at Aveline with an expression that said everything without needing a single word. Aveline closed her own door, sat on the edge of a bed too grand to feel like hers, and let the entire weight of the night fall on her at once. The note came the next afternoon. A young woman with red hair knocked at the door, entered without a word, and handed over a small folded square of paper. On it, in the firm hand of a man accustomed to signing decrees and deciding fates, there was a single line: "Dinner tonight, if you accept." Aveline stared at it far longer than the sentence required. If you accept. As though she had a real choice. As though the dinner had not been inevitable from the moment she had said, "I accept," in the center of the northern hall, with her legs shaking and her heart in her throat. And yet there was something in the "if you accept" she could not quite dismiss. A small irritating courtesy she had not asked for, which somehow made it weigh more than it should have. The dining room was small by castle standards. A table set for two. Torches along the walls, a narrow window letting in the deep blue of an autumn night. Thane was already there, standing by the window, a glass in hand, in the posture of a man who has arrived early and used the time to think. He wore something simpler tonight. A plain shirt, no armor, none of the ball's formality, and Aveline had the misfortune of noticing that the absence of armor did not make him any less overwhelming to look at. If anything, it made him harder, because armor at least was something to look at, instead of him. Why does he have to be so tall, she thought, with the resignation of a woman who knows the thought leads nowhere useful. He saw her enter, and gestured toward the chair without ceremony, as though they were two people long accustomed to dining together, rather than two who had met 3 days ago under circumstances she was still quietly, every hour, attempting to process. She sat. He sat. For a moment neither spoke, and it was less uncomfortable than it had any right to be. "I know you're confused," Thane said at last. That low, direct quality she was beginning to recognize as simply how he spoke. No softening run-up, no cushion laid down before the hard thing. "I don't intend to offend you with what I'm about to say, but I think you've earned the truth of it." Aveline set her elbows on the table. "I'm listening." He did not look away. "The plan was mine. I arranged it with my brothers before we ever crossed the floor to you. The 3 of us courting you. The 3 of us contesting for you. So that when I finally claimed you, no one in that hall could challenge it without looking like a fool." A pause. "A woman desired by all 3 Duskbanes in a single night is not a woman anyone questions in public." Aveline was silent a moment. "So your brothers didn't truly want me?" "My brothers would drive me to madness in a real contest, without hesitation." And there was almost amusement at the edge of his mouth. "Torin, especially. I took a slash to the ribs that still reminds me daily that he took the fighting more seriously than the courting. A beat. What I mean is the plan was mine. The execution was theirs. And they are constitutionally incapable of doing anything without genuine effort, which irritated me more than once that night." Aveline pressed her lips flat against the thing they wanted to do. So it was a performance. All of it. The whole hall watched a performance, and I was the only one who didn't know the lines. And she waited for the anger to come, the clean, useful anger, the kind she could hold on to, and it came. But it did not come alone. It came tangled with something worse, something small and ashamed that she did not want to look at directly. Because for 2 years she had built her whole life around a single sentence a man had promised to say in a hall. She had let that sentence become the roof over her, the reason she rose early and swallowed insults and kept the flame cupped in her hands. And she saw now, sitting in a borrowed room across from a stranger who wanted her, that she had never once asked whether she was worth wanting. She had only asked whether she would be wanted, as though those were the same question, as though her whole value were a thing kept in someone else's pocket, waiting to be handed back. And here was the part that frightened her. Not the plan, not the performance, but the hungry, undignified thrill that had gone through her anyway when she understood a king had arranged an entire night around choosing her, as though the wanting were the point, as though it mattered less who did it than that someone did. That she thought, that is the thing I have to watch. Not him, me. Why? She said aloud, because the safest ground was his motives and not hers. Why go to all that trouble? Thane set down his glass. Because I've wanted you for a long time. She frowned. The ball was the first time It wasn't. His voice was quiet and certain. The first time I saw you, you were standing in the middle of a riot in your own village. I'd come north on a matter of politics and passed through the market by chance. A brief pause. You didn't notice me. You were too busy holding a crowd together with nothing but your voice and your 2 open hands, as though every one of those villagers belonged to you, as though keeping them from harm were as natural to you as breathing. His blue eyes did not leave her face. I noticed you. Aveline went very still. Your scent reached me before I could even see you clearly through the chaos. Rare, strong. The kind an entire pack would recognize if they understood what they were feeling. A pause. And I stayed exactly where I was, because you were being courted by a mate who had risen out of that same hard life. And I had no right. Something moved through his gaze. Not nostalgia. The weight of a thing carried too long. The bond of a mate is a powerful thing, Aveline. Fighting it would have been like fighting the tide. So I stayed where I was. Until that night in that hall when he threw away the one thing I would have crossed a kingdom for. And I could not stay where I was any longer. The silence that followed had texture. Aveline looked at the table, at her hands, at the window. Anywhere at all, but the blue eyes fixed on her with an attention she found unbearable, and worse impossible to wish gone. You should also know, Thane said gentler now, that you are not a prisoner here. It can be a union of convenience, if that is what you prefer. Your own rooms, your freedom, your own choices. I did what I did, so that you would not walk out of that hall humiliated. The rest of it is yours to decide. A union of convenience. She looked at him. At the firm jaw. At the shoulders no armor could diminish. At the eyes watching her with a patience she had not asked for, and was finding it harder and harder to ignore. How she thought, half mortified and half wanting to laugh, does a person say, I do not want a union of convenience, without sounding like an absolute fool. I want to fulfill the obligations of a mate, she said. Low, slightly flushed. The dignity of a woman being honest at cost. I don't want convenience. Thane held her gaze long enough for the heat to climb all the way up her face. Then I'll wait, he said quietly, until there is nothing left in that choice but you. No echo of anyone else. There is nothing left, she wanted to say. There is only you. I don't want him. What remains is a scar where a bond used to be, and that is all. But the word stayed lodged behind her teeth. Stubborn. The way everything stayed in a woman who had learned young to guard what she felt, as though feeling itself were a coin someone could steal. She nodded, and she left with her composure intact, and her pulse betraying her the whole length of the corridor. The first weeks in the South were made of small things. The way the pack began coming to her to settle the disputes that used to go straight to Thane, a grazing quarrel, a marriage gone sour, a boundary stone moved in the night. The way Torrin's guards greeted her with a slight incline of the head when she crossed the courtyard, the same incline they gave the brothers, no more and no less. The way Odette laughed again, really laughed for the first time since the ball. And the way Aldrich ambushed her in corridors. "You know," he said one morning, materializing out of a side passage with a steaming cup and the smile of a man who had slept well and woken with ideas. "The offer technically still stands. If you change your mind and pick me, I'm considerably more entertaining on a daily basis." Aveline opened her mouth. "He is," said Thane behind her. She turned. He stood at the mouth of the hall, arms crossed, eyes on his brother, with an expression she was still learning to read something undeniably possessive beneath the calm surface. Aldrich raised both hands in surrender. The smile stayed. "I'm merely being helpful. Be helpful in another corridor. This is my castle, too. Aldrich." The name came out with that low final note she had heard in the hall. And Aldrich, with the theatrical resignation of a man entirely satisfied with having pressed exactly as far as he had meant to, bowed to Aveline, murmured charmed as always, and vanished down the passage as though he had done nothing wrong in his life. Thane watched the empty corridor a moment, then turned to her with a face so carefully neutral she knew at once there was something underneath it. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she answered. Neither of them mentioned the dinner, which was in its own way an entire conversation. She should have known the peace would not last, because peace in Aveline's experience had always been a thing on loan. It broke on an afternoon a month into the South when Thane came to her chamber, wearing an expression she had learned to distinguish from the others. Not the weight of the kingdom, but something more personal, more careful. He sat at the small table by her window and interlaced his fingers, and she knew before he spoke that whatever he had come to say, he had already turned it over many times, looking for a gentler shape, and failed to find one. "I had your lineage looked into," he said. Aveline stopped. "Your family is from the East, many generations back." His eyes stayed on her face. "They were a house of considerable standing once, a strong bloodline, a respected name in those lands. And then something happened. A threat of some kind, one I haven't fully traced, but enough that your ancestors fled. They abandoned everything. Name, rank, land. And they began again far enough west that no one who wanted them could follow." Aveline was quiet for a long moment. She thought of her mother, of how little she could still reconstruct of that face, of how her mother had never once spoken of any family, of how her father had always turned the subject aside with the practiced ease of a man who had been turning it aside his entire life. They knew, she thought. They knew, and they never said a word. "The scent you noticed," she said slowly, "at the ball. It's the old blood. Few can recognize it because it hasn't surfaced like this in generations. But it's in you with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt." A pause. "You have always been what you are, Aveline. Ball or no ball, kingdom or no kingdom. whether or not a single man in the north ever had the sense to see it. She should have felt only wonder, and part of her did. But there was a colder thread woven through it, and it came from a memory she could not shake: the face of Aldous Vale in the shadow of that column, watching his son's ruin, without a flicker of shame. Watching. Counting. His father wasn't angry, she said aloud, before she had decided to. At the ball, when it all fell apart, everyone was the whole hall was, and he just stood there, thinking. Thane's expression did not change, but something behind it sharpened. No, he said. He wasn't angry. And that was when Aveline understood that he had been thinking the very same thing, and had simply been waiting to see whether she would arrive there on her own. The truth came apart, slowly, over the following 2 weeks in pieces neither of them wanted. It was Aldrich who assembled them. Aldrich who wore charm, the way other men wore coats, and beneath the coat was a mind that missed almost nothing. He had spent years reading the courts of the North the way a physician reads a pulse, and what he read now he did not like. He laid it out one evening in Thane's study, the 3 brothers, and Aveline gathered close the fire low. The Vale claim to their eastern holdings, Aldrich said, is not as clean as 3 generations of Vales have pretended it is. The land they've grown fat on the estates, the mills, the tithes was seized. Long ago. From a house that vanished so completely, everyone assumed the line was dead. He looked at Aveline. It wasn't dead. It ran west and sold fruit in a market. The room went still. Aldous Vale has known who you were for longer than any of us. Aldrich went on, quieter now. Since before the ball. Your scent isn't only rare to a man who has spent his whole life guarding a stolen inheritance. It is a ghost walking into his own hall. You are the living proof that the land his family holds was never his family's to begin with. So it was never about being poor, Aveline thought, and the floor of her stomach dropped away. It was never about the dress or the coin or being the daughter of no one. He made his son throw me away because I was the daughter of someone. Because if I ever carried my true name, everything he owns would have my name on the deed instead. He told his son to sever the bond, Torin said flatly, so you'd be unclaimed, unprotected, a woman with no pack behind her and no name to invoke. Easy to lose. His jaw was tight. And then he'd have arranged for you to be lost. Except Aldrich said, his son fell apart over it in public. 3 of us picked you up off the floor, and Thane marked you in front of 400 witnesses before Aldous could move. He didn't plan for that. He planned for you to walk out of that hall alone and disappear on the road home. Aveline sat very still, because it should have made her afraid. And it did. But underneath the fear, low and unfamiliar, was something else. A hard, clean current she almost didn't recognize because she had spent so long being the girl things were done to. The girl who was chosen or not chosen, kept or thrown away. And here for the first time was a man who had wanted her gone, not because she was nothing, but because she was a threat. I have never in my life been a threat to anyone, she thought, and found to her own surprise that she did not entirely hate the feeling. Aldous Vale did not come with swords. That was the thing about him Aveline was learning. He was far too clever for swords. He came with the law. The letter arrived at the southern castle, bearing the seal of the northern court, and the co-signing marks of 3 of the oldest pack elders. Men whose word carried weight across every kingdom. Men too old and too respected to be simply refused. And what the letter contained was not a threat. It was worse than a threat because a threat could be met. It was a formal challenge to the legitimacy of the claim. Aldrich read it aloud, and his voice, for the first time since Aveline had known him, carried no lightness at all. Lord Aldous Vale, acting, he claimed, in the interest of the wronged young woman, and the good order of the old traditions, contested Thane's mark on the grounds that it had been taken improperly. That the Alpha King of the South had exploited a woman in the very moment of her deepest public humiliation. That no true consent could be given by a person so freshly shattered in front of so many eyes with no time to think and nowhere to turn. That the claiming had been not a choice, but a rescue dressed as a choice, and a rescue under the old law was no foundation for a bond at all. He called for a trial of the elders, a gathering of the great houses, a judgment, and if the judgment went against them, the mark would be dissolved, the bond broken, publicly, by law, and Aveline would be exactly what Aldous Vale had needed her to be from the start, unclaimed, unprotected, hers to lose. "He's turned it inside out," Aveline said, and her voice was not quite steady. "He threw me away to be rid of me, and now he's using the fact that someone caught me as the reason to throw me away again." A terrible laugh caught in her throat. "He's going to stand in front of the great houses and pretend he's defending me. From you." "Yes," Thane said. "Because if you defend me, it looks like ownership. And if you stay silent, it looks like guilt." She pressed her fingers to her eyes. "There's no move on the board that doesn't help him." "No," Thane agreed in that low, even voice. "There isn't one for me to make." And something in the way he said it, the small, deliberate weight on the word me, made her lower her hands and look at him. Help came from the two places she least expected. The first was Aldrich, who set aside his wine and his charm, and became for a span of weeks something colder and more useful. A man moving through the courts of the North, gathering threads, calling in debts, a lifetime in the making, finding the old men who remembered the old seizures and the old records that Aldous Vale had spent a fortune trying to bury. And what Aldrich brought back near the end, he brought back gently, because he had learned the shape of it before he told her, and he knew what it would do. "Your parents didn't die of a fever, Aveline," he said. She had been standing by the window. She did not turn. "There was a fever in Elmsworth the year they died. That much is true. It gave a very convenient cover to men who were already looking." A pause, and even Aldrich's steady voice thinned around the edges of it. Vale's people had traced the old bloodline that far even then. Your father knew he'd been found. It's why he moved you and your sister twice in a single winter. It's why there was never any family. He wasn't hiding from shame. He was hiding you from them. And in the end, they found him anyway. The room was very quiet. Aveline stood at the window with her back to all of them, and she did not cry, and she did not speak. And for a long moment, the only sound was the fire. "They died protecting a secret they never even told us," she thought. "We grew up poor and frightened and alone, and we thought it was just bad luck. We thought that was simply the shape of our lives. And all along, it was a debt someone else's greed had written in our blood." Her father's face came to her. Not the deathbed face, but an older one from before. A man always turning the subject aside. A man who never sat with his back to a door. She had thought it caution. She had thought it grief. She had never once thought it was fear-worn so long it had simply become the way he stood in a room. "You could have told me," she thought. "I would have carried it. I would have carried it for you. And then underneath that quieter and harder, I am going to carry it now." The second help came from a name Aveline had not expected to hear again. The young woman with the composed smile. The one Corwin had claimed at the center of the northern hall. The one who had crossed a crowded room to whisper, "I'm sorry," into the wreckage of Aveline's worst night. Her name, it turned out, was Isolde. She came south quietly, without escort, having slipped the leash of a family that had never once asked her what she wanted. And she asked to see Aveline alone. And when they sat across from each other, the two women who had been placed on opposite sides of a scale, neither of them had built, we sold, set a small bound bundle of letters on the table between them. "I was raised in the Vale household after my father made his arrangement," she said. Her voice was steady in the way of a person who has decided to be brave and is holding the decision with both hands. They stopped watching what they said in front of me. People do with a girl they've already decided is furniture. A thin, hard smile. "These are Aldous Vale's letters, to his agents, about the Eastern holdings, about your family, about what he needed done and why." Aveline stared at the bundle. "Why?" she said. "Why would you—" "Because I stood in that hall while a man unmade you to keep a lie," Isolde said, "and everyone called it my wedding." She did not look away. "I have spent my whole life being handed between houses like a sealed letter no one bothered to read. I am done being the reason another woman gets thrown away." A pause. "You didn't lose a contest, Aveline. I told you that once. I'd like to help you prove there was never a contest at all, only a theft, and two women standing on top of it." And Aveline looked at this girl who had every reason to hate her, and had chosen the opposite, looked at the letters that had cost her something to steal, and would cost her far more to hand over, and felt something turn over in her chest that had nothing to do with any bond or any mark. Not against each other, she thought. He put us against each other, and we're not going to stay there. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the two small words could hold. The trial was set for the turning of the season. The great houses would gather. The elders would sit. And Aldous Vale would stand before all of them and speak in his patient, reasonable, terrible voice of a wronged girl and a stolen consent and the good old order of things. And Aveline would be expected to sit quietly beside her king while the men decided what she was. She spent the last night before it in Thane's study. The fire burned low, the challenge letter and the stolen letters lying side by side on the table like two halves of the same wound. When they call the trial, Thane said, "I'll speak for you. I'll bring what Aldrich found, what Isolde carried. It should be enough." A pause. "It has to be enough." Aveline looked at the two piles of paper, at the record of a theft 3 generations old, at the proof that her parents had been hunted to their graves, at the whole enormous machinery of one man's greed laid bare on a table in a room that smelled of pine and low fire. And she thought of every hall she had ever stood in, silently. Every time she had lifted her chin by millimeters and said nothing, because saying something would have cost her the last thing she had, which was her dignity, in the eyes of people who had already decided she had none. She had been that girl her whole life. The one things were done to. The one who was spoken for. "No," she said. Thane looked up. "You won't speak for me." Her voice was quiet. It did not shake. "If you stand up and defend me, it looks like exactly what he'll say it is. A king protecting his property. It plays his game on his board." She met his eyes across the low fire, and something in her had gone very still and very certain. "This is my name he's built his whole life on top of. My mother's face I can't remember. My father who died with his back to a door, so my sister and I could sell fruit, and never know why. She stood. So when they called the trial, Aveline said, I'm going to speak for myself. For a long moment, Thane said nothing at all. He simply looked at her, the girl he had watched hold a village together with 2 open hands, the woman who had just told the Alpha King of the South to sit down and let her stand. And then he did the last thing she expected. He smiled. Small, real, the kind he never gave to the hall or the decrees. I know, he said, and she understood all at once that he had known it before she had. That he had been waiting the way he had waited in that northern hall. One step back, letting her say the first word for her to arrive at her own strength and pick it up. Outside the narrow window, the season was turning, and somewhere to the north, a patient man was rehearsing a reasonable speech about a girl who could not speak for herself. He had no idea. She was about to. The morning of the trial, Aveline dressed herself. She did not send for the red-haired girl who usually came to help. She did not wear anything the Cecil had given her. She wore the ivory dress, the one Odette had sewn, stitch by candlelight, the one she had walked into the northern hall, believing was the finest thing she would ever own. It had a small tear near the hem, now mended so carefully you had to know it was there to find it. And she had thought once that the dress was a foolish thing. The most foolish thing she had ever put on her body. She did not think that anymore, because a man had built his entire fortune on making her family invisible. And she was going to walk into a room full of the most powerful people in 5 kingdoms, wearing the proof that a poor girl and her sister had made something beautiful out of nothing at all. Odette fastened the last of it at the back of her neck fingers, steady, and then rested her chin on Aveline's shoulder for a moment, and met her eyes in the glass. You're not shaking, Odette said. I know. You were shaking at the last one. I know, Aveline said again, and then quieter. I'm not the same girl who walked into the last one. Odette's arms came around her from behind, and neither of them said anything else. Because some things do not need saying between 2 people who once shared a bed too small for them and pretended to sleep so the other would not hear the silence. The great hall of the southern castle had been remade for judgment, where the moon ball would have kept a wide floor clear for claiming this room had been arranged for the opposite, for the weighing of a thing, not the celebration of it. The elders sat along a raised bench at the far end, old men and old women, whose word-crossed borders, their faces carved out of patience and long memory. The great houses filled the benches along the sides. Banners hung motionless in air, too still to stir them. And at the center, where a mate would have knelt, there was only an open space, a place to stand and be judged. Aveline walked in on Thane's arm, and she felt the whole room turn to look, and she did not flinch from it. Torin stood near the front with his guards, arms crossed, jaw set, watching the crowd, the way a man watches a river he suspects of rising. Aldrich had positioned himself near the elder's bench with a folio of papers and the pleasant, bland expression of a man holding a knife behind a smile. Odette took her place at the side, and near the back, half hidden and utterly alone, sat Isolde, having crossed a kingdom to be in the one room her family had forbidden her. Then the far doors opened, and Aldous Vale came in. He came in the way she remembered him standing in the north, unhurried, composed, faintly terribly serene. He wore mourning gray, which was a choice, and Aveline understood the choice. At once he had dressed himself as a man, burdened by duty, come reluctantly to do a sad and necessary thing. Behind him, pale and stiff and looking at no one, came Corwin. He brought his son, Aveline, thought. Of course he did. A grieving father needs a grieving son beside him. It's better theater. The eldest of the elders, a woman with a voice like dry stone, called the trial to order. And she named the charge that the mark upon Aveline of Elmsworth had been improperly taken consent extracted from a woman in the moment of her ruin, and that the bond should therefore be dissolved by the old law. Then she looked at Aldous Vale and bid him speak, and he spoke beautifully. That was the horror of it. He did not rage. He did not accuse. He stood in the open center of the room, in his mourning gray, and he grieved out loud, with exquisite control for a poor girl who had been humiliated by his own foolish son. He owned that he said he would carry the shame of his son's weakness to his grave, and who had then, before she could so much as draw breath, been swept up and marked by the most powerful man in the South. What consent, he asked, the room gently, could a shattered girl give in such a moment? What is a rescue but a cage? A woman is too grateful to see the bars of... He was not here to attack the king. He was here, he said, for her, to give her the choice that had been stolen from her twice now, to set her free. And Aveline watched the room begin to believe him. She watched it move across the benches like a shadow crossing a field. The small nods, the softening faces, the old men and women who had come prepared to be suspicious of a king, and were being handed instead a kindly grieving lord, asking only for a girl's freedom. She felt Thane go still beside her. She felt him gather himself to rise to speak, to lay Aldrich's evidence on the table, and she put her hand on his arm. Not yet, the touch said. Not you. She stepped forward before anyone had called her name. I'll speak. 2 words, and the room which had been warming to Aldous Vale like a hearth went abruptly, completely still, because a woman was not expected to speak at her own trial. She was the thing being weighed, not the one doing the weighing. The old woman on the bench regarded her for a long moment, then inclined her head. Speak then. Aveline walked to the center of the room, to the open space where a mate would have knelt, where instead she now stood alone in a mended ivory dress in front of 5 kingdoms. And for one heartbeat, the old fear rose in her, the fear of every hall she had ever stood silent, in the voice that said, lift your chin and say nothing. It's the only dignity they'll let you keep, and she let it rise, and she let it pass, because she was done being dignified in silence. Lord Vale is right about one thing, she began, and her voice did not shake. I was humiliated. In front of 400 people. In a dress my sister made me with her own 2 hands, believing the way you believe things when you're young, and you love someone that being chosen was the same as being worth something. She let that sit. He's told you he grieves for that girl. He's told you he's here to give her back the choice she lost. She turned slowly to face Aldous Vale directly. I'd like to tell you why he really made sure I lost it. And then she began to lay it down. Not with rage. She had learned in a month of low fires and stolen letters that rage was exactly what he wanted from her. The shattered girl, wild and grieving, proving his whole case with every word. So she did not give it to him. She gave him something worse. She gave the room the truth plainly, in order, the way her father must have wished he could have years ago, before the fever gave the hunters their cover. She named the Eastern holdings, the estates, the mills, the tithes. The Vale family had grown fat on for 3 generations. She named the house those holdings had been seized from a house that had not died, but fled west and changed its name, and sold fruit in a market. She named her mother, whose face she could not remember. Her father, who had moved 2 frightened girls, twice, in a single winter, and never once told them why. Who had died, she said, not of a fever, but under the cover of one hunted to his grave, to keep a lie standing. And then Aldrich stepped forward from beside the elder's bench, and he laid the records on the table, and Isolde rose from the back of the room, alone, unescorted, a daughter of the very arrangement Vale had built, and she walked the whole length of that silent hall, and set her bundle of letters beside the records. His own hand, Isolde said to the elders, her voice steady, with the particular courage of the quiet. To his own agents, about her family, about what he needed done and why. She lifted her chin. I was raised in his house. I heard what he said when he thought the furniture couldn't hear. He didn't have his son throw her away, because she was poor. She turned and looked at Aveline, and something passed between the 2 women that the whole room could feel. He threw her away because she was the rightful owner of everything he has. The hall did not breathe. Aveline watched Aldous Vale's composure crack, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the small ways a very controlled man comes apart. The stillness in his hands going too still, the color leaving the skin around his mouth, the morning gray suddenly looking less like grief and more like exactly what it was, which was a costume. And she watched Corwin. Corwin, who had gone white beside his father. Corwin, who was staring at the letters on the table as though they were written in a language he was only now, far too late, learning to read. Because whatever else, the boy was weak, obedient, a son who had spent his whole life doing what he was told. Aveline saw in his face that this part he had not known, that his father had let him believe he was rejecting a poor girl for the good of the family, and had never told him he was helping to bury a theft. I didn't know, she thought. He was a coward. But he wasn't this. His father made a weapon of him, and didn't even tell him what he was aimed at. It did not excuse him. Nothing excused the bell and the dissolution and the ruin of her worst night. But she found, looking at him, that she did not need it to. The 2 things could simply both be true. The eldest of the elders let the silence hold for a long, terrible moment. Then she spoke. Aveline of Elmsworth, you have accused Lord Vale of a great crime. You understand what you are asking this council to do. I do. And what is it you ask? Speak it plainly so it may be recorded. And here it was. The place where every story Aveline had ever been told said she should ask for his ruin. His holdings stripped, his name broken, his son cast down. The whole weight of 5 kingdoms brought down on the man who had hunted her family to the grave, who had unmade her in a hall of 400, who had built his entire life on the erasure of hers. Revenge, clean and total and deserved. She looked at Aldous Vale, and for one moment she let herself want it, all of it, every last inch of it, because she was human, and she had earned the wanting. And then she thought of her father, moving his daughters twice in a winter. Not because he wanted to destroy the men who hunted him, because he wanted his girls to have a life that was not built around them. He had spent his whole life not becoming the thing that chased him. And it had cost him everything, and he had done it anyway. I could break him, she thought. And I would spend the rest of my life being the girl who broke him. He would live in me forever. I'd carry him the way my father carried the fear until it stopped being something I did and started being the way I stand in a room. I don't ask for his ruin, Aveline said. A murmur moved through the hall. She heard Aldrich go still. She felt even Thane turn to look at her. I ask for the truth to stand on the record, where it can't be buried again. Her voice was quiet, and it carried to every corner. I ask that the Eastern holdings be returned to the house they were taken from, which is mine and my sister's, and no one else's. Not as revenge, as what should have happened 3 generations ago." She looked at the old woman on the bench. "And I ask that he answer to the law. Yours, the one that's older than his money, and doesn't care how well he grieves in gray." She turned one last time to Aldous Vale. "I'm not going to hate you," she told him. And it was not a kindness. It was the opposite of a surrender. "You spent a lifetime making sure my family stayed small and frightened and quiet. If I spend the rest of mine hating you, then you've done it. You've made me small. You've kept a piece of me forever." A pause. "So no, I forgive you. Not because you've earned it, because I'd rather be free than be yours." And she watched that land on him harder than any sentence the elders could have passed. Because she had taken the one thing he had counted on: her rage, her grief, her ruin, and she had simply set it down. And a man who has built his whole life on making other people small has no idea what to do with a woman who refuses to stay that way. The elders withdrew to confer. It did not take them long. The holdings were ordered returned. The record was made and sealed and copied to every kingdom's archive so that it could never again be quietly lost. And Aldous Vale was stripped of the honor of his seat before the great houses and remanded to the judgment of the old law, which was slower than a sword and heavier, and gave him a great deal of time to sit with a truth he could not spend his way out of. He did not look at Aveline as they led him out, but Corwin did. He came to her afterward in the emptying hall when the benches had cleared and the banners hung slack and the only sound was the far-off murmur of a kingdom coming down off the edge of something. He stopped a careful distance away, closer than the north, but careful. And there was something in his posture Aveline had never once seen in the 2 years she had loved him. Not the tight jaw of the hall, not the fury. Something smaller and more honest and more his own. "I didn't know," he said, "about your family, about what he—" He stopped, swallowed. I'm not saying it to be forgiven. I threw you away for a reason I thought I understood, and it was already the worst thing I've ever done. And now I find out I didn't even understand that." A breath. "I just needed you to know I didn't know. That's all." Aveline looked at him, and she waited for the old ache to come, the 2 years of it. The promise guarded like a flame in the wind, the dress, the bell. And it came faintly, the way the memory of pain comes long after the wound has closed. But it did not have teeth anymore. It was just a thing that had happened to a girl she used to be. "I believe you," she said. And she did. "You were a coward, not a monster. There's a difference, and the difference matters. And it still doesn't change anything between us." A pause, and her voice gentled, which was somehow harder for him than anger would have been. "Do you still feel it?" The bond. Corwin's jaw worked. Sometimes, like an echo. "That's all it is now. For me too." She held his eyes. "It's not that I hate you, Corwin. It's that when I look at him, she did not need to point. The whole room knew who him was. There isn't any room left for anything else. I didn't know it was possible to feel this. I spent 2 years thinking what we had was as much as a girl like me could hope for. A small, unguarded honesty. I'm almost grateful you showed me I was wrong. Almost." Corwin stood there a moment longer. Then he looked past her to Thane, and he did the last thing she expected. He inclined his head. Not in fear, in recognition. The kind that costs a proud man more than anger ever could. Then he turned and walked out of the hall and out of the story she was done telling about him. Aldrich appeared at her shoulder with a cup of wine he had produced from somewhere, wearing an expression of quiet, enormous satisfaction. "Well," he said, "that was objectively the finest trial these kingdoms have seen in a generation. And I've seen a few. I fell asleep during most of them." He took a sip. "You didn't even let me use the second folio. I prepared a second folio. I'll let you use it next time." "There won't be a next time. That's the tragedy of doing a thing perfectly." He said it lightly. But then he looked at her, and for once the charm dropped entirely away, and what was underneath was plain and unguarded and true. "My brother chose well," Aldrich said. "I told you that once in a corridor, and then I ran off before you could answer, because I am a coward about sincere things." A pause. "I'll say it properly this time. You've done him good, Aveline, and you did that in there." He gestured at the empty center of the hall, "entirely on your own." She didn't have an answer that would fit, so she just reached out and squeezed his arm once, and he let her. And that was answer enough for both of them. The seasons turned the way they do, and a year later, the South held the moon ball. It was a different thing than the Northern Hall had been. Not in size, they were near enough the same, but in feeling. The Southern Hall carried the particular solidity of a kingdom that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone that had built its name over generations, and did not lean on display to hold it up. Families came from every kingdom with the usual blend of alliance and curiosity, and Aveline received them beside Thane with a clear and quiet awareness that 1 year ago she had stood on the other side of this exact equation, arriving at a ball with her heart in her throat and a dress her sister had sewn, hoping only to be chosen. "Look where you are now," she thought. Not with vanity, with that quiet, disbelieving gratitude that comes when a life you had given up on turns around and surprises you. She stood with one hand resting without quite meaning to over the gentle swell her gown could no longer hide. 4 months. Thane had gone perfectly still for 3 full seconds when she told him. Not shock. The stillness of a man storing a moment before letting it move. Then he had crossed the room without haste and pressed his mouth to her forehead with a tenderness so quiet she'd had to look away so she wouldn't weep in front of him. She wept anyway. He pretended not to notice. It was their oldest agreement. "Are you all right?" he murmured now, leaning slightly toward her as another family made its bows. "You ask me that every single day. I have a genuine interest in the answer." She turned to him with the look she had developed specifically for that line, half exasperated, half surrendered, entirely useless as any kind of resistance. And he received it with the composure of a man who knew precisely the effect he had, and had no intention whatsoever of stopping. It was Odette who saw him first. Aveline felt her sister go still at her side, and followed her gaze to the center of the hall, where the bell had just rung for the 2nd time that night, and where Torin now stood alone in the open space with the posture of a man exactly where he had decided to be, and no interest at all in drama about it. Aveline took her sister's hand. "Go," she whispered. "My legs are shaking." Odette whispered back. "I know. Mine were too." Aveline squeezed once. "Go anyway." And Odette went with trembling legs and a lifted chin, and the smile Aveline had known since her sister first learned how to make one the kind that does not fit on a face when it's real. Torin met her at the center of the hall with his usual economy of motion. But when his eyes found Odette's, There was something in them Aveline had never seen in the young commander before. Something the fighting and the guarding and the whole hard-forged surface of him had been keeping quiet a long time. "Odette of Elmsworth," Torrin said, and his voice carried steady and clear to every corner of the stone. "I'd like to claim you as my mate, if you'll have me." The hall murmured. Odette did not move for a moment, and Aveline stood there, with Thane's hand coming to rest lightly over her belly, over the small life there that belonged to both of them. And she watched her little sister, who had sewn an ivory dress by candlelight for a night that broke both their hearts, and then somehow remade their whole lives, be chosen at the center of a hall by a man who had crossed a kingdom's worth of his own stubbornness to do it. And her heart was so full, there was no room in it for anything else. Later, when the ball had cooled into the gold of the late hours, she found Thane by the window. Always by the window, in the posture of a man who ruled a kingdom and never entirely turned it off, but who had learned over a year to turn it down enough when she came into a room. He turned before she said anything. She crossed to him and rested her forehead against his chest, and his arms came around her with the absolute naturalness of a thing that has long since found where it belongs. His hand slid slowly to her belly and stayed there warm and still. She thought of her mother's face she still could not fully rebuild. Her father, who had died, with his back to a door, so his girls could grow up not knowing why. She thought of the small house, the too small bed, the two of them pretending to sleep so as not to frighten each other with the size of the silence. It was always just us, she thought. I truly believed it would be just us forever. And now there was this hall, and this man, and this hand, and a sister being claimed in a room full of people who would step aside for her the rest of her life, and a life of her own growing that would never once have to wonder what it was worth. They would have liked him, she thought, and it was the most peaceful thought she had ever had about her parents. "Thane," she said. She lifted her head just enough to find the blue of his eyes in the low light. "Have I told you I love you today?" She felt his chest shift, that low, rare laugh that belonged to no hall and no decree, the one that existed only here, only in the small, true hours only for her. "Tonight," he said. "Not yet." Aveline smiled. "I love you."